Welcome to The Deep Dive, the show where we take a massive stack of sources and turn it all into the essential knowledge you need to be brilliantly informed.
Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into John Maynard Keynes. And this is a figure whose shadow just stretches across every single major economic debate of the last century.
Oh, absolutely.
He's the single person most responsible for transforming economics from this, niche academic field into a central tool of government policy.
We're talking about the father of macroeconomics, right?
Oh.
The man whose radical ideas basically saved capitalism during its worst crisis, the Great Depression.
Exactly. But he was also this massive contradiction, a hugely successful investor who literally wrote the book on why markets fail.
And a free trade advocate who then did a complete 180 and pivoted hard to protectionism.
So our mission in this deep dive is really to unpack that paradox. We're going to examine how one man who was, primarily trained in mathematics and philosophy of all things, completely revolutionized economic theory.
And not just theory. He challenged core tenets like the invisible hand, and then he went on to design the entire global financial order after World War II.
We really have to get into the mechanics of it all. Aggregate demand, price stickiness, the multiplier, and also explore the surprising personal life that I think really fueled his extraordinary confidence.
It's such an important mission because, well, as we saw after the 2008 crisis, his ideas just never truly go away.
They're cyclical.
They are. Time magazine said it decades ago that Keynes' radical idea that government should spend money they don't have may have saved capitalism. He keeps coming back every time the free market system looks like it's about to collapse.
So to understand the revolutionary, you really have to start with the man. John Maynard Keynes was born in Cambridge, England in 1883, and he was born into this intellectual but also very grounded upper-middle-class family.
It really sounds like the perfect petri dish for producing someone who was just utterly convinced they could solve the world's problems.
Absolutely. Think about it. His father, John Neville Keynes, was a prominent economist and logician. His mother, Florence Ada Keynes, became the first female mayor of Cambridge.
Wow.
So he was supported, he was loved, and that translated into this lifelong, almost unshakable confidence in his own intellectual ability to find solutions. And just as importantly, a real faith in the ability of educated government officials to do good.
The fascinating part to me, though, is that his actual academic foundation wasn't in economics at all.
Not really, no. It was math first.
Right.
He was a brilliant student, earned a first-class BA in mathematics from King's College, Cambridge in 1904. But his real passion at the time, his deepest intellectual leaning, was toward philosophy.
And his formal economic training was, what? Almost nothing.
Almost nothing. He attended just one term of lectures, and that was informally as a graduate student.
That is just astonishing. He becomes the single most influential economist of the 20th century, basically invents an entire subfield, and he's almost entirely self-taught in the subject.
Well, it speaks volumes, doesn't it? Biographers often point to his optimistic background, that stable, educated, socially unified class, as being crucial. He just lacked the ideological rigidity of people who spent decades learning and internalizing classical orthodoxy.
So he wasn't tied down by tradition?
Not at all. It allowed him to challenge the entire structure of economic thought when the real world, the Great Depression, showed that the old structure was fundamentally broken.
Okay, so let's unpack this journey. Let's jump into Section 1, the making of a revolutionary WWI and the trauma of Versailles. Before the war, he was laying the groundwork, right? He went back to Cambridge in 1908 after getting bored with the civil service.
Yeah, he was just not cut out for that kind of bureaucracy. He was initially funded by people like Alfred Marshall to lecture in economics. And he worked extensively on probability theory, which later became his really important book, A Treatise on Probability, in 1921.
But his first real dive into practical economics was Indian currency and finance in 1913.
Yes, and this was a very detailed analysis of the Indian monetary system.
And what was the situation there?
Well, the Indian rupee was tied to silver, but it was becoming more and more convertible to gold or the pound sterling. Keynes, showing this early grasp of monetary policy, basically recommended formalizing that process, speeding it up. Yeah. I was essentially arguing for a gold exchange standard.
So right away you see him moving from abstract theory to, well, practical policy design.
Immediately. And that practical genius was, as you said, put to the ultimate test during World War I. He joined the Treasury in 1915.
And this is where his reputation for, what was it, nerve and mastery was really forged.
It was. His role was crucial. He was managing the terms of credit with Britain's allies and, most importantly, acquiring the scarce foreign currencies they needed to fund the war.
And the story about the Spanish pesetas really shows his strategic brilliance. It's more than just supply chain management.
Oh, it truly is. So in 1917, the British government desperately needed Spanish pesetas to finance its huge purchases in neutral Spain, and Keynes managed to secretly buy up enough to cover the government's immediate needs.
So the normal thing to do would be to just hand it over, solve the problem.
Right. The traditional approach would be to solve the immediate shortage and move on.
But he didn't do that.
No, he refused. Instead, he chose to sell the entire massive block of pesetas back onto the market. He intentionally flooded it.
Wow.
It was an incredibly aggressive, high-risk move. It wasn't designed just to meet the demand, but to fundamentally crash the price of the peseta.
To make it cheaper for the government to buy more in the future.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He was prioritizing long-term structural advantage and market control over just, immediate tactical relief.
That must have been a very contentious choice inside the conservative treasury.
Highly contentious, but it worked. It was like economic judo. He received the Companion of the Order of the Bath for his service, but this triumph was, well, it was quickly overshadowed by the trauma of the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919.
This event really changed him, didn't it? It didn't just change his career, it changed his whole economic philosophy.
It was a defining break. He served as the Treasury's financial representative, focusing on German reparations, and his objective was clear from the start. Keep the compensation payments low enough that the German economy wouldn't be irreparably damaged.
He had this incredibly prescient vision, didn't he?
He really did. Keynes understood that setting reparations too high wouldn't just hurt Germany, it would destabilize the entire European financial network, creating these massive, crippling trade and debt imbalances that would, inevitably lead to future conflict.
He wanted reconstruction, not punishment.
Exactly. But he was overruled by hardliners who were demanding just ruinous sums of money.
Right. He was up against these conservative powers, the ones he famously called the Heavenly Twins, Lord Sumner and Lord Cunliffe.
And they were demanding astronomically high reparations. Keynes just realized the mood was vengeful and punitive. It wasn't economically rational at all.
And his own counterplan to resolve the war debt issue was just as radical, but it got shot down by the U.S.
It did. He proposed this major international scheme to write down almost all the inter-allied war debts, the UK owed the US, France owed the UK, and so on. And then he wanted to shift 2/3 of the cost of European reconstruction onto America's deep pockets.
But America was the largest creditor. They weren't going to go for that.
Not a chance. They saw it as, they'd already sacrificed enough, so they flatly rejected it.
And this rejection, combined with a harsh treaty, it just disgusted him on both a moral and an economic level. And that led to his dramatic resignation.
His resignation was immediately followed by his devastating polemic, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. And the book was a global sensation. It was this mix of blistering character assassination. His descriptions of Woodrow Wilson are legendary, with sharp, accessible economic analysis. He argued the treaty was a recipe for catastrophe.
The language in that book is still shocking today. He paints it not as a peace deal, but as an act of calculated cruelty.
He wrote of the policy of reducing Germany to servitude for a generation. And his ultimate warning, which is just tragic in hindsight, was his prediction that impoverishing Central Europe would lead to that final war, before which the horrors of the late German War will fade into nothing.
A devastating, chilling prediction that, well, the rise of the Nazis and the start of World War II seemed to prove completely correct.
It did. But here is where we have to introduce a necessary historical counterpoint, something that really speaks to the complexity of this whole debate.
Yep.
While Keynes's book was profoundly influential and it shaped the popular view that the treaty was ruinous, later historians have presented a more nuanced picture.
What's the counter-argument then?
Well, historians like Niall Ferguson and others have argued that the treaty wasn't necessarily unduly harsh in economic terms because of what happened next. They point out that in the decade that followed, Germany received a massive net capital inflow from American loans.
So American money was basically recycling through the system, funding the payments, and preventing the collapse Keynes feared.
Precisely. That capital inflow was estimated to be roughly 4 times the eventual size of the Marshall Plan after World War II.
Wow, that's a huge number.
It is. So while Keynes' critique was a brilliant polemic, some modern scholars see it as ultimately flawed in its economic prognosis. They'd say the treaty's real failure was political, not purely financial. But regardless of the debate, the book made Keynes an international celebrity. It cemented his status as the anti-establishment intellectual.
So if Versailles showed Keynes the political failure of the establishment, the economic turmoil that followed really provided the catastrophe he needed to unleash his intellectual revolution. Let's move into Section 2, the Keynesian Revolution challenging neoclassical orthodoxy.
Yeah, the 1920s in Britain were just characterized by high unemployment, and it was compounded by this disastrous decision by Winston Churchill in 1925 to put Britain back on the gold standard at a cripplingly high pre-war parity.
And Keynes was completely against this.
Relentlessly. He argued the gold standard was forcing Britain into unnecessary deflation and austerity, just strangling the domestic economy. He responded immediately with the economic consequences of Mr. Churchill, arguing austerity was actively making things worse.
But the real trigger for the revolution was the Great Depression, starting in 1929. The collapse of global demand, mass unemployment. It just validated all his worst fears about market instability.
And he was a trenchant critic of the orthodox response, which was, balance the budget and let wages fall.
Which, to Keynes, was just suicidal.
Completely. He argued that in a severe slump, budget deficits weren't a symptom of failure. They were, in his words, nature's remedy that cushioned the economy from total collapse. He was arguing for counter-cyclical public spending right away. If the private sector won't spend, the government has to.
But he needed more than just a policy prescription. He needed a proper theoretical argument to back it up.
And that arrived in 1936 with his magnum opus, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money.
This book is really the foundation of modern macroeconomics, isn't it? It just shattered the existing framework.
Utterly. It provided the theoretical justification for activist, interventionist government policy. It challenged that core classical belief that free markets would automatically, just sort themselves out and return to full employment.
So what exactly was the established orthodoxy he was fighting against?
He was fighting against Say's law, which is often summarized as supply creates its own demand. The classical economists believed that every act of production generates income that must eventually be spent. So unemployment, in their view, was just temporary or voluntary.
And the catastrophe of the 1930s, with idle factories and millions of people desperate for work, showed that theory was just deeply flawed in practice.
It showed it only applied in a special case, the case of an economy already at full employment. Keynes said his theory was the general theory because it applied to all situations, and he countered Say's law with a couple of interconnected concepts.
The first one being price stickiness.
Yes. Classical theory required perfect flexibility. If there is a slump, wages should fall, making labor cheaper, so firms hire more, and you get back to full employment.
But that doesn't happen in the real world.
Not really. Keynes pointed to what he called nominal wage rigidity. Workers just refuse to accept lower money wages.
And why is that? Why are workers so resistant to wage cuts, even if economists say it's rational?
It's a mix of things. You have institutional factors like union contracts and minimum wage laws, but there are also psychological factors. No one wants to be the first to take a pay cut, right?
Of course not. It's terrible for morale.
Exactly. It damages morale, often reducing productivity more than the money saved. So this stickiness meant the price mechanism was too slow, and it allowed the economy to settle into a stable but very damaging low employment equilibrium.
So the economy gets stuck in a trap. And the government's role is to be the external force that breaks that trap.
Precisely. Which leads to his second critical concept. Aggregate demand, or A.D. Keynes, argued that A.D., the total planned spending in the economy, is the variable that matters most. To get people back to work, you have to increase total expenditure first.
So it wasn't a shortage of goods. It was a shortage of willing buyers, a failure of demand.
A failure of effective demand. If confidence is low, businesses won't invest, and consumers will hoard their money even if interest rates are zero. This is what we now call a liquidity trap, and it means traditional monetary policy becomes useless.
So the government has to step in and spend directly.
It has to. It must directly increase expenditure, either through public works or transfers, just to jumpstart the cycle.
And this is where we get to the most famous and, I guess, most contentious part of Keynesian policy, the multiplier effect.
The multiplier is the engine of the stimulus. It Basically says that an initial injection of government spending will lead to a total increase in national income that is way bigger than that initial amount.
Okay, so walk me through the mechanics of that. How does it actually work?
Let's use an example. Say the government spends £100 million building new road. That money immediately becomes income for construction workers, suppliers, engineers.
Okay.
Now, Keynes focused on what he called the marginal propensity to consume, or MPC. It's just the fraction of any new income that people choose to spend rather than save.
Right, so if the MPC is, say, 80%, that means people spend 80 pence of every new pound they get.
Correct. So the construction workers spend 80% of their new 100 million, that's 80 million pounds, on groceries, cars, rent. And that 80 million pounds becomes new income for grocers and car dealers and landlords.
And then they spend 80% of that, and the cycle continues.
It continues. The spending flows through the economy, getting smaller each time, but adding up very quickly. So an initial 100 million pound expenditure doesn't just generate 100 million pounds of activity, but potentially 3, 4, or 500 million. It's like throwing a pebble in a pond.
It's an engine starter for an economy stuck in neutral. He had that great line, "With men and plants unemployed, it is ridiculous to say that we cannot afford these new developments."
Yes. It is precisely with these plants and these men that we shall afford them. The spending pays for itself many times over.
But this sounds a little bit like a perpetual motion machine. What was the strongest argument against this idea back in 1936?
The main argument was something called crowding out. The idea was that if the government borrows money, it drives up interest rates, which makes it more expensive for private businesses to borrow. So you just cancel out the stimulus effect.
The famous crowding out argument. Still hear that today?
We do. But Keynes countered that in a depression. When confidence is low and nobody wants to borrow anyway, crowding out is impossible. If the government is borrowing idle savings, it's just putting money to use that would otherwise be stuffed under a mattress.
And while the orthodox economists were hostile at first, his ideas started to gain support, especially in the U.S., laying the groundwork for the New Deal and, crucially, for the massive government spending of World War II. Let's move to Section 3, the global architect trade, imbalances, and Bretton Woods. This is where Keynes shows a really surprising intellectual shift, pivoting away from a pillar of classical thought he once believed in, free trade.
This turning point was definitive, and it happened between 1929 and 1931. I mean, Keynes was a student of Alfred Marshall, who was an absolute free trader, but the inflexibility of the British economy convinced him that protectionist measures were necessary, especially during a severe downturn.
So for him, domestic full employment was more important than the ideal of free trade.
It trumped it. He stated flatly that economic recovery is only fully effective if a country eliminates its trade deficit. Otherwise, stimulus spending is just leaking out of the country. You're paying for foreign goods and creating foreign jobs.
Which led him to actually advocate for tariffs.
In detail. In late 1930, he proposed a uniform tariff of 10% on all imports, later suggesting 15% on manufactured goods. He was fundamentally criticizing the whole theoretical basis for global specialization, Ricardian comparative advantage.
Okay, let's just clarify what he was rejecting there. What is Ricardian comparative advantage in simple terms?
In simple terms, it's the idea that every country should specialize in producing whatever it's relatively best at, even if it's not the absolute best at anything. The theory is that this maximizes global efficiency and wealth.
But it relies on some pretty big assumptions, right? Like frictionless markets and mobile labor.
Huge assumptions. And he argued those conditions just don't exist in reality, especially during a depression. If a domestic industry shuts down because of foreign competition, the unemployed workers don't just magically migrate to a new, more efficient job.
No, they face real costs. Retraining, moving, searching. Unemployment becomes chronic.
Exactly. So the supposed gain from specialization often disappears when you factor in the very real social costs of long-term unemployment.
He actually started defending the idea of having a national diversity of production.
He did. It's captured perfectly in his 1933 article, National Self-Sufficiency. And this essay reads almost like an anti-globalization manifesto, especially coming from him. He said, "I sympathize with those who would minimize economic entanglement among nations, but let goods be homespun whenever it is reasonably and conveniently possible, and above all, let finance be primarily national."
He also believed that trade wasn't necessarily a force for peace, that it could lead to conflict.
He fundamentally disagreed with that idea. He concluded that with modern technology, most mass production could be done efficiently in most countries. So the economic loss from favoring domestic production was minimal, and it was easily outweighed by the political and social advantages of self-sufficiency and full employment.
And this whole mindset, this protectionist, anti-imbalance mindset, was the foundation for his vision for the post-war world, which he took to Bretton Woods in 1944.
He led the British delegation, and he was advocating for his comprehensive Keynes plan for an international clearing union, or ICU. His goal wasn't just reconstruction, it was to create a system that would prevent the massive destabilizing trade imbalances that had caused so many problems before the war.
And the famous banker currency was central to this plan.
The banker was the unit of account for this ICU, a common world currency to manage trade. The ICU would essentially be a global central bank, and all international transactions would be cleared through this system.
But the truly radical part was the idea of equitable adjustment, forcing the creditor nations to share the burden of fixing imbalances.
This is so critical. In the existing system, only debtor nations, the ones running deficits like Britain, were forced to adjust through painful austerity. Keynes argued that the creditor nations, the ones with huge surpluses like the U.S., were just as responsible for global instability because their surpluses were destroying aggregate demand worldwide.
So he wanted to penalize saving on a global scale. How would that have worked?
Well, the ICU would apply an interest charge, a penalty on persistently large surplus accounts. If a country ran a massive surplus and just sat on its banker reserves, they would start losing capital. This would force them to either buy more imports or invest their capital internationally.
It's a brilliant, elegant solution. It automatically generates demand and keeps the global economy in balance.
It was. But the political reality was that the U.S., as the world's dominant creditor nation, was never going to agree to being penalized for its success.
Right.
And that's the tragedy. The American delegation, led by Harry Dexter White, pretty much overruled the Keynes plan. Keynes was forced into a compromise that established the IMF and the World Bank, but critically, the adjustment burden fell almost entirely on the deficit countries. The U.S. dollar became dominant.
And yet, economists still revisit that negotiation all the time.
All the time. J. Bradford DeLong is just one of many who've argued that on almost every major point where Keynes was overruled by the Americans, especially on penalizing creditors and the need for capital controls, he was later proven correct. The instability caused by massive, unregulated global capital flows, which Keynes wanted to restrict, contributed directly to the breakdown of the system in the 70s and the later crises.
Despite the compromises, though, Keynes still felt that getting the IMF and World Bank established was a massive step forward. He said that if the institutions remain true to their founding principles, the brotherhood of man will have become more than a phrase.
And now we can chart the impact of his life's work in Section 4, the cycles of influence ascendancy, stagflation, and resurgence.
Because the moment World War II began, Keynesian ideas moved from being this controversial theory to just established practice.
World War II was, in the words of John Kenneth Galbraith, the perfect demonstration of Keynesian ideas. The massive government borrowing and spending needed for the war effort instantly wiped out unemployment. You couldn't have had a better real-world lab to prove his point.
And after the war, Keynesianism became the consensus across the developed world.
For about 2 decades, from 1950 to 1970, Keynesian policies were standard. Governments actively managed the business cycle. This period is often called the golden age of capitalism. High growth, low unemployment, or rising middle class.
The consensus was so strong that Time magazine declared in 1965, "We're all Keynesians now."
Exactly. And this consensus was built in part on a simplified understanding of the trade-off between inflation and unemployment, often visualized through the Phillips curve.
The idea that there's a reliable inverse relationship. To get lower unemployment, you have to accept a little more inflation and vice versa.
Right. Governments thought they could just pick their spot on the curve. They could fine-tune the economy.
But that simplification was the very thing that made the whole consensus vulnerable when the 1970s hit.
The arrival of stagflation, the simultaneous presence of high inflation and high unemployment, just shattered that confidence. The simple Phillips curve suggested this shouldn't happen. But it did, especially after the oil price shocks of 1973.
And stagflation provided the opening for the intellectual counter-revolution led by the monetarists.
Milton Friedman was their most formidable voice, and he had predicted stagflation as early as 1968. He argued that sustained Keynesian expansionary policies could only temporarily boost employment. In the long run, he said, they only lead to higher inflation without affecting real output.
So the government could influence the dollar price of things, but not the actual number of jobs or cars produced.
Precisely. Friedman argued that workers would eventually catch on to the inflation, demand higher wages, and push the economy back to its natural rate of unemployment, but now at a much higher inflation rate. This critique, combined with the chaos of the 70s, successfully undermined the Keynesian consensus.
And the international structure he'd helped build also began to fray, favoring the deregulated, globalized model he had warned against.
That's a key point. The Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates began breaking down. In 1971, the U.S. suspended the convertibility of the dollar to gold, allowing capital to flow freely across borders. By the late 70s and 80s, the UK and US had officially moved away from Keynesianism.
So his principles entered this period of relative dormancy in the mainstream until the next major systemic crisis.
Which was the 2008 global financial crisis. The sheer magnitude of that demand shock sparked an immediate and massive Keynesian resurgence.
The policy change was stunningly fast.
It was. Governments worldwide, led by the US and UK, embraced fiscal stimulus and massive bailouts to prevent demand from collapsing entirely. The Financial Times called it a stunning reversal of the orthodoxy of the past several decades.
And even his radical Bretton Woods ideas were given a second look.
They were. In 2009, the governor of the People's Bank of China, Zhu Xiaochuan, publicly argued for adopting Keynes' original vision, a centrally managed global reserve currency, the Bancor idea, implemented via IMF special drawing rights.
So his ideas were back on the table, but they had evolved into something more intellectually robust than the simple models of the 1960s.
They had evolved into new Keynesian economics. This school of thought retained the core policy implication that government stabilization is necessary, but it rebuilt the foundation to address the monetarist critiques.
What was the key difference between the new Keynesians and the old model?
Well, New Keynesianism accepted some tenets of the New Classical School, especially the idea that people operate with rational expectations. But they combine this rationality with an acknowledgement of market failures, specifically the existence of sticky prices and sticky wages.
So, people are rational, but the real world of contracts and morale prevents prices and wages from adjusting instantly.
Exactly. And because markets adjust slowly due to these frictions, a rational government stabilization policy can lead to a much more efficient outcome than a pure hands-off approach. It can prevent those catastrophic low-employment equilibriums that Keynes identified 80 years before.
This deep dive would just be incomplete without getting into Section 5, the philosopher, investor, and contradictory man. For a man who focused on the cold logic of macroeconomics, his personal life was just marked by this passionate philosophy, cultural enthusiasm, and profound contradictions.
He was a genuine Renaissance man, a central figure in the famed Bloomsbury Group of intellectuals and artists, a group that explicitly rejected rigid Victorian morality.
And how did his time in the Bloomsbury Group influence his worldview?
It provided the philosophical ballast for his iconoclasm. He was deeply influenced by G.E. Moore's ethical philosophy, which prized the pleasures of human intercourse and the enjoyment of beautiful objects. This wasn't just a hobby, it was his moral framework.
So that commitment to aesthetic and intellectual honesty gave him the confidence to reject economic dogma, just like he rejected social dogma.
I think so. And he translated this commitment into massive public service for the arts. He personally supported the Cambridge Arts Theatre. During World War II, he helped secure vital government funding for institutions like the Royal Opera House. And most critically, he became the founding chairman of the Arts Council of Great Britain in 1946.
He also collected fine art Cézanne, Picasso, and historic documents.
Yes. His passion for history was obvious in his acquisition of Isaac Newton's papers. Based on those documents, Keynes wrote a famous essay describing Newton not as the first of the Enlightenment thinkers, but as the last of the magicians. It shows Keynes' own fascination with that transition from mystical to rational thought.
Now let's talk about his personal life, which was marked by a great deal of openness about his sexuality, which was later weaponized by his political opponents.
In his early life, within the Bloomsbury circle, he was openly homosexual. He kept meticulous diaries about his encounters. His supreme male love was the artist Duncan Grant.
And how did his opponents use this against him?
In a deeply unpleasant way. Critics of his lenient stance towards Germany after the war would suggest his views were suspect, distorted by his personal feelings for a German negotiator. And later, his childlessness and early life were used to attack his economic theories, suggesting they lacked the long-term vision that only a family could provide.
But despite identifying as bisexual, he did later marry.
Yes. In 1925, he married Lydia Lopokova, the celebrated Russian ballerina. It was a union that was initially surprising to his friends, but they were exceptionally happy. It was described as a marriage of beauty and brains, and it provided him immense stability and joy.
Okay, let's pivot to his other great contradiction. His phenomenal success as a private investor. The inventor of macroeconomics was a master of the market.
It's truly fascinating. Many great economic theorists are terrible investors. Keynes was not. He made one huge mistake, nearly getting wiped out in the 1929 crash. An error he admitted was because he was focused too much on the big picture and not enough on market psychology.
But he recovered quickly.
Very quickly. By the time of his death in 1946, his net worth was equivalent to about £23 million today. And he did this while refusing to sell into a falling market, which he considered antisocial.
And he managed the King's College endowment, right?
For decades, he radically shifted its strategy away from conservative assets like land and bonds and into stocks, particularly small and medium-sized companies with strong growth.
So he wasn't a trader, he was a long-term strategist.
Absolutely. He's seen today as an early pioneer of value investing, buying solid businesses for the long haul and ignoring the daily noise. It shows that while he questioned the stability of the market, he certainly believed in its underlying dynamism.
But we have to address the most jarring contradiction of all, his social views on eugenics.
Yes, and this is a fact that requires careful contextualization. Keynes was a lifelong proponent of eugenics, which today we rightly view with horror. But in the early 20th century, this was a mainstream, though highly misguided view held by many progressive intellectuals and scientists across the political spectrum.
And he wasn't just a passive believer, he was actively involved.
He was. He served as the director of the British Eugenics Society from 1937 to 1944. And as late as 1946, he called eugenics the most important branch of sociology which exists.
It's a disturbing intellectual blind spot for someone so brilliant.
It is. It shows a highly confident intellectual applying that same rationalist planning impulse, the one that sought to manage the economy, to the realm of human biology, a movement with deeply troubling ethical consequences.
And despite all these internal conflicts, his political stance was consistently anti-communist and liberal.
Resolutely liberal. He refused to hold political office, believing he had more influence as an independent intellectual. He was vehemently anti-communist, dismissing Marxism as a misunderstanding of Ricardo. He really preferred the educated bourgeoisie, whom he believed carried the seeds of all human advancement over the boorish proletariat.
What an extraordinary tapestry of intellects, contradiction, and impact. Let's bring this deep dive to a close with our outro.
We've covered Keynes's immense legacy, haven't we? The rejection of the automatic full employment model, the invention of counter-cyclical government spending, and his effort to build a system of managed, regulated international trade.
His core achievement, really, was providing a legitimate intellectual framework for government intervention in a crisis. He showed that laissez-faire capitalism, though powerful, was just prone to these catastrophic failures that only proactive public spending could solve.
He died in 1946. He'd suffered a series of heart attacks, likely made worse by the exhausting post-war loan negotiations he undertook with the U.S., which he described as absolute hell.
He won the favorable loan terms for Britain, but at a severe personal cost.
He did.
And it's in this context of exhaustion, right near the end of his life, that we find what is maybe the final, most profound irony, the provocative thought we want to leave you with. Just before his death, Keynes was speaking to a colleague, Henry Clay, about the capitalist engine he'd spent 2 decades trying to fix.
And he told Clay that he found himself more and more relying for a solution of our problems on the invisible hand which I tried to eject from economic thinking 20 years ago.
The invisible hand, that cornerstone of Adam Smith's classical theory, the ultimate symbol of the free market he had rejected.
It's a stunning thing to say. It just raises the essential question. Did Keynes, at the end, confess some doubt about the ultimate efficacy of his own revolution?
Or does this comment suggest something else? Maybe the ultimate utility of Keynesianism isn't in permanently replacing the market, but in serving as this sophisticated, necessary emergency brake. That he wasn't the enemy of capitalism. He was its most acute diagnostician. He knew the engine was fundamentally sound, but just inherently prone to these catastrophic failures of confidence.
His final acknowledgement might have been the recognition that his entire life's work was dedicated to creating the tools to moderate that powerful, creative, but also destructive force of the capitalist engine, to ensure it could survive its own worst tendencies. It wasn't about destruction, it was about stabilization.
And that idea that the market needs an intelligent, rational mind acting as its engineer during a crisis is still the defining question of political economy today. And it's one that Keynes forces us all to answer.